Are we rolling?
Yep, we're rolling live.
Okay, great. Hi, everybody. Thanks for tuning in today. This is Damien here from the Environment section of Council, and we're stoked to have Nadia here from the Australian Museum, and she's going to give us a bit of an insight into the FrogID app and how you can use it at home. So welcome, Nadia.
Thanks for having me. I'll just open my presentation.
Great. Now, as we go along, folks, if you tuned in, feel free to put any questions in the comments box as we go along, and we can try and answer those questions as we go.
Yeah, and thank you, Damien. I can't see that screen, so if you'd like to just shout out whenever you want me to answer questions, that would be really great.
No problem.
Great. Well, hopefully you can see my title slide at the moment. Sometimes Zoom plays up on me, so give us a yell if you can't. But thanks for having me. I really am happy for this opportunity to share some news about our project with you all, which is FrogID. First of all, I'd really like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the country on which I am presenting from today, and that's the Cabrogal clan of the Darug Nation. And I'd like to pay my respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and recognise their continuing connection to land and culture. So I am presenting today on behalf of a big team at the Australian Museum, and yeah, let's jump on in. I'm going to tell you all about FrogID, how amazing our Australian frogs are, how our project is informing science, in particular in the aftermath of the fires last summer, and how you as individuals can join us and thousands of others across the nation in informing frog research and conservation. So if you're on the line at the moment, I would love for you to just mute your video or your microphone so there's no any feedback, because I will be playing some calls. Thanks. Great. So firstly, what is citizen science? It's a bit of a buzzword in Australia and the globe at the moment. It's actually been recognised by governments all across the globe in informing more policy change and how we do conservation. So it's not only related to biodiversity projects, but any scientific project that involves community participation. It's also known as community science, crowdsourced science, or volunteer monitoring. But whatever you call citizen science, it's research conducted in whole or in part by non-professional scientists. And importantly, it's another way of doing science. It's not replacing traditional scientific methods at all, but it's another way of doing science and harnessing the skills and the passion of our community to help answer questions about the world. So first, a little bit about me before I jump into the project side of things and how I began to work in citizen science. I studied environmental science, and the more I went out in nature, the more I fell in love with it. And I decided to always find ways to surround myself in nature and conservation. So I volunteered a lot, and eventually that volunteering led me to a job opportunity at James Cook University, where I began working as a rainforest biologist, a tropical biologist in the wet tropics on a citizen science project, working with people from all across the globe, which is really great. And citizen science has now become part of my professional life as well as my personal life. And these are photos of me volunteering in my spare time for projects such as bat box monitoring in Victoria or bird life surveys in Queensland and other sites. And so through citizen science, someone like me who spends lots of time in nature can build skills and also contribute valuable observations of the natural world to scientific research without having to be an expert. So some of you listening today are probably nature enthusiasts like me, and hopefully today you too will become a citizen scientist if you're not already. And so the Australian Museum is now where I am fortunate to work from. And some of you may have visited the Australian Museum in Sydney. It's the oldest museum in Australia. And we have the Australian Museum Research Institute, which is where we provide a focal point for all of our research. And we focus on key areas such as climate change, biodiversity loss, and also understanding effective biodiversity conservation. So the Australian Museum Research Institute has a long history of citizen science projects that we currently manage with collaborators, some of the most well-known citizen science projects in Australia, and FrogID being just one of these. For example, we have DigiVol, which is an online digitisation volunteer program where you can transcribe data from natural history collections. And we also have the Australian Fishes Project, which allows you to upload, identify and comment on any observations of Australian and New Zealand fishes and investigate their growth and patterns and their shape. So we have several citizen science projects based at the Australian Museum, and FrogID is our flagship citizen science project. But why do we start FrogID? Well, our team established FrogID for several reasons, and a big reason is that frogs are in a lot of trouble globally. There are hundreds of species thought to be extinct and many others threatened with extinction. So when people think of endangered animals, they might think of big charismatic megafauna such as rhinos or tigers, or fluffy iconic mammals like koalas. But today, let's consider frogs, because actually frogs are threatened, more threatened, and declining more rapidly than other animal groups. In recent years, scientists have become increasingly aware of the worldwide decline in our number of frogs, and 42% of all amphibians are threatened with extinction, and they face a number of threats. So disease is a major threat to frogs. So amphibian chytrid fungus is a deadly frog disease, which humans may actually be helping to spread, unfortunately. So this is when the fungus attacks parts of the frog's skin that have keratin in them. And since frogs use their skin in respiration, this makes it really difficult for the frogs to breathe. The fungus also damages the nervous system, affecting the frog's behavior, and so they eventually die, unfortunately. Another threat is habitat loss and degradation. It's also a major threat to biodiversity. And pollution. Frogs generally spend part of their life cycle in water, and most of their skin are especially sensitive to pollution. So it's one of the biggest threats to frogs. Introduced species as well. Exotic fish such as trout, carp and goldfish eat native frog eggs and tadpoles. And in Australia, the cane toad competes with native frog resources. The wildlife trade is also a booming international trade that is threatening frogs for food, pets, medicine and scientific purposes, and is a trade that is now jeopardizing the continued existence of many of our species. And of course, there's climate change, and climatic changes have already impacted amphibians through changes in breeding phenology, so the timing of their breeding cycles, their loss of breeding sites, changes in moisture regimes, and possibly increased impact of disease. The species of most concern are those with narrow home ranges, or species that are found at the top of mountains with nowhere else to go, and species that occupy really specific breeding strategies that are really sensitive to change. Unfortunately, climate change is also likely to have a compounding effect on other stresses and exacerbate negative impacts even more. And at the moment, it's no different in Australia. Unfortunately, our frogs are also in trouble. We have about 242 species of frogs, including the cane toad, but overall the picture isn't that great. There are 4 species that are officially extinct, and perhaps the highest profile of those is the gastric brooding frog pictured here. And it lived in Southeast Asia and was declared extinct in 2002. This photograph at the top is a specimen that we have of the gastric brooding frog at the Australian Museum. And as its name alludes, it's a gastric brooder, so meaning the female's eggs developed inside of her stomach, which is amazing because she could actually turn off her stomach acid to allow these eggs to develop, and she would give birth to them through her mouth, which is extraordinary. So in addition to that, we have 30 other species that are threatened with extinction, and that includes species that are critically endangered, like the crowberry frog. And this beautiful frog in the alpine areas of New South Wales and the ACT, the biggest threats to these frogs are disease, but also other threats that we've talked about already. But why should we really care about frogs? Are these little things, does it really matter if they disappear? And the short answer to this is a big yes. We should care about frogs because, one, they're important bioindicators. They're inherently tied to water. So most frogs have their tadpoles in water, not all frogs, but most frogs. They also can lose water quite quickly. So slight changes makes it impossible for them to survive. They're also cold-blooded and dependent on external sources for body heat. So they're the same temperature as their external environment, making them intricately linked to specific conditions, and they can be severely affected and let us know when something's not right in the ecosystem. And although frogs are really tiny, they make up a huge part of our ecosystem. Frogs themselves eat a lot of invertebrates, including pest species. And so things that might eat crops are also eaten by frogs. And they're also eaten by a lot of things like snakes and birds. So they're a really important food source to many animals in the food web. The tadpoles also are important because they eat algae, which helps keep our streams clean. Unfortunately, there is research out there that has found what happens to our streams and our rivers when tadpoles and frogs disappear and ecosystems collapse. So if we lose frogs, it changes everything. And we don't want to lose all the important roles that they have in our environment to keep it healthy. Plus, many of our species occur nowhere else in the world, so they're unique and they're special to our country. And another reason to care about frogs is maybe for our own benefit, but we're increasingly using secretions and the chemicals in frogs that frogs produce in their skin as antibacterial and antifungal medicines. So we want frogs to be around. They're really amazing, they're really unique, and there really are benefits to conserving frogs for our ecosystems that we depend on. So frogs are in trouble and they're important. And aside from the threats we've talked about, one of the biggest obstacles to frog conservation is our lack of knowledge. We really don't know much about frogs at all, and that's another reason why we created the FrogID project. So this is a map of all of the scientific records for frogs in Australia from the Australian Atlas of Living Australia, sorry. And in any one area, so where you might live, for example, there might be between 10 to 40 different species of frogs that you can find there in a short distance. But what you can see here is that there are large parts of Australia that don't have any records of frogs. And it's not that frogs aren't there, they are there, it's just that we don't have scientific records of them. And that's a real problem when we want to decide things around land use and conservation action. When we zoom further into New South Wales and Sydney being where that arrow is, we realise just how much of this country has no scientific records of frogs at all. But frogs are there, we just don't have records of them. So back when FrogID first kicked off in 2017, Atlas of Living Australia actually had about 500,000 records, scientific records of frogs across the country. So FrogID is really contributing to this. We really need to do something to help fill these knowledge gaps. And again, even with the frogs that we do know about, we don't know that much about them at all. This is a graph of the known frog species we have in Australia over time. And you can see that we're still going up. We're still discovering new species in recent years, and there's still so much more to understand about them. So for example, many species were found in the last decade, and in fact, 14 frog species were found in 2016. Sorry. No. Oh, sorry, hello. Sorry about that. Oh. So this frog here that we have pictured is the Cape York graceful tree frog. That was described by our scientists back in 2016, and its scientific name is Litoria bella. And you can see that it's actually only discovered recently. Oops, one moment. But even more recently, in October, was the southern heath frog that was discovered by science. And so this was previously confused with the northern heath frog, Litoria johni, and new research by the University of Newcastle, South Australian Museum, and our team at the Australian Museum actually shows that they differ to the northern counterpart. So this species was split up, and this is really exciting because this species is the latest to be described by science in Australia, and there's still so much to discover in terms of Aussie frogs. So this lack of knowledge about frogs and the threats that frogs face is an urgent issue. We need everyone to help get the information that's necessary to save our frogs. But there's no way scientists can count Australia's frogs on their own. With FrogID, citizen scientists like you and I can help put frogs on the map. The next reason why we created FrogID is related to one of the neatest things about frogs, which is that they call. But why do frogs call? We know that frogs croak or chirp, and they can even hoot, but why do they call? And what drives frogs to call throughout the night from your backyard pool or pond or creek? The biggest clue to this is that almost all frog species that call are male. And in fact, that noise you hear in your backyard pond or your creek or your dam is actually a sweet serenade to male frog love song to attract female frogs. And because every species has a different sounding call, you can identify frog species just by listening. You may need to turn up your volume for the next few slides, but I really just wanted to share these next few with you to show you the diversity of frogs around Australia and why they're so amazing. So first we have the striped rocket frog, which is from northern and eastern parts of Australia. It's a loud wick, 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 wick sound. Hopefully you heard that. Please turn up your volume if you need. This is another species from northern Australia. It's a little similar, but you might be able to tell the difference. Oops. And next, from northern Australia again, we have one of my favorites. It is the northern spadefoot, and it's similar to an owl. And next, we have the Cape York graceful tree frog with a long, low-pitched call.
Excuse me, Nadia, the frog sound didn't seem to be coming through then. I'm not sure what the situation is.
Okay. None of them came through?
The first one did, but the next two didn't.
Okay, there might be a bit of a lag. Let me try this one and let me know. I'll give it a bit more time to see if it actually needs to catch up. How did that go? Could you see it calling and calling?
I could see it, but couldn't hear it. Yeah, I'm not sure what's going on there.
All right. See how we go. I can't see any settings that might change that, unfortunately. I'll just have a quick look. This is a common frog that's found in backyards. It's the Perrin's tree frog, and it sounds like a maniacal cackle, it's described as. Hopefully you can hear it.
It doesn't seem to be coming through, unfortunately.
Oh, I'm sorry about that. Well, unfortunately, the sound is not coming through, but if you do have access to the internet, you can also visit our webpage where all of 242 frog species and calls can be reached. I will try my best to describe what they sound like phonetically. But the next is an eastern dwarf tree frog, which is similar to a ratchet sound. And so I'll just give this a go, but I'm sorry if it can't come through. But do look at the FrogID website or the FrogID app if you'd like to listen to these calls. So I'll just keep on going. Sorry about the sound. So by making all of these different noises, frogs are revealing what species they are, and sometimes it is much more accurate to understand what species it is by its call. Images alone can make it really difficult to discern between species, and here is an example of this. Here are two related species of the stream frog and a visual representation of their calls. So I won't bother playing their calls. They're quite faint on this slide, so unlikely that you'll be able to hear them if you couldn't hear the others. But you can see from the visual representation of their calls that they're actually very different in frequency and in pitch, but they look very similar. So this is why we focus on frog calls for the FrogID project, because images alone aren't very accurate sometimes to identify the species level. So calls are really handy for species ID, and that helps our FrogID project. Not only that, but it's actually expert verified, meaning that the FrogID project provides or builds up a robust, scientifically accurate data set, because every record is listened to by one of our experts and verified. So not only can we ID the species, but we can tell a lot from calls. We can tell what breeding seasons, if these are shifting, what habitats they need to breed in, what species diversity is in a certain location. We can tell the number of frogs within a single recording, and we can also tell frog call variability within species and also between species. And the last reason why our team created FrogID was because it would be able to use the power of citizen science to collect data on large spatial and temporal scales, normally not feasible. So the country is really too big for our scientists to do this alone, and there's way too many frogs to go out there and count. So that's where citizen scientists like you and I come in to help put frogs on the map. So in summary, FrogID is a citizen science project that's nationally and relies on two main things, and that's technology through the FrogID app and the fact that frogs call. It's the most up-to-date field guide to frogs of Australia. I mentioned that Cape York graceful tree frog and the southern heath frog that was newly described to science. Well, we had to change all of our technology and our information online and in the app to increase the number of species. And so it really is the most up-to-date field guide to Australia's frogs. But the main use of FrogID is to record, submit the calls of frogs to help fill our knowledge gaps and conserve frogs much better. So next few slides, I will dive into the FrogID app a little bit. Do feel free to jump in with any questions you might have. This is often where we find a lot of questions from users. So when you sign up to FrogID, you'll be asked to take the FrogID pledge, because safety is the #1 priority for you and also our frogs. So we ask that you only FrogID safely. The beauty about FrogID is that you can do this without disturbing habitat and frogs too much. So when you first open the app, you will be taken to the recording screen, and you just simply click that red recording button to start recording a frog call. Even if you're unsure if it's a cricket or a frog call, please do record, and we will let you know what you have recorded. When you have submitted a call, you can go through the app in your profile and check that things are looking all right, check that everything is submitted. Sometimes when you're in areas of low network coverage, for example, the recording won't upload until you're back in network coverage. So it's good to check these things every now and again and submit anything that you want our species experts to listen to. We'll also let you know via email, so you can also check that online through your email as well as the app. I mentioned that FrogID is the most up-to-date field guide to Australia's frogs. So this is where we have information on what period of the year frogs will call. So some frogs call more during the cooler months, some frogs only call once a year, some call only when it rains. So it's really, really variable. And so we have information on the calling period, also the description of the species. You can listen to the calls on the app as well as the website, and you can understand a little bit about their habitat as well as their distribution and similar species. So there are many frog species that look similar, and this is a really great tool. You can also filter by location, so you can use a toggle on the app to select frogs near me, and that will only produce frogs that are within your location and that are likely to be calling at that time of year. So I'm not sure if this will play, but that's all right, I'll give it a go. But this is a recording of 3 different species in a beautiful creek. Frogs are really fantastic. You might not be able to see them, but you can certainly hear them. And these 3 species are calling. So if I was out in this area, what I would do is just point my phone in the direction of the frog call and click record for 20 to 60 seconds. And that is all it takes to contribute to our science project. This is a bit about the back end of the database. This is what our species experts can see in the back end when you submit a call. So you don't need to think about anything else after you hit record and submit. The app automatically adds the time, the date, the latitude, longitude, and it also provides an estimate of location accuracy, which is really important for scientific research. While it's not as automatic as a Shazam is to music, it's very scientifically accurate because each submission is, again, listened to by one of our experts. So you can see what information is received on the back end on this slide, and this is where our FrogID call validators will email you from. And amazingly, FrogID has only been going on for 3 years. We've just passed our 3-year birthday in November, and each dot on the map here represents a FrogID recording. And we've received over 200,000 calls submitted to the program since 2017. And that's pretty remarkable when you think about where we first started. So in those 200,000 calls, we've actually verified over 300,000 individual frogs. And this is remarkable because I mentioned earlier that the Atlas of Living Australia had only 500,000, not only, a large amount, 500,000 records of frogs on the database at 2017. And we, in 3 years, have reached over 300,000. So it's amazing what people power can do and what we can achieve if we harness together with citizen science. We've really gained momentum in the last year, largely thanks to the increased rain lately, in particular recent months, thanks to La Nina. But FrogID has been going crazy in the last few months particularly, and it's been an intense and happy time for our team listening to all those calls. But over 20,000 frog calls were submitted in 1 month alone recently, and so that's really exciting to see how this will really change things for Australian frog conservation and research. So since the last 3 years, we've been predicting frog species richness at a continental scale, and as such, we're providing a really valuable data set to biodiversity and conservation in Australia. So we provide all this data to Atlas of Living Australia, but also we provide the clean data and even the unbuffered data to state atlases. So platforms like BioNet will receive our important data so that that's used by land use and conservation management. These are just some thumbnails of all the species or some of the species that we have recorded over the last few years. And if you do want the latest stats on what species and findings we have, do follow us on our social media platforms. Here is all our top 20 species that we recorded through FrogID. All frogs are not recorded equally, of course. Crinia significa, which is the common eastern froglet, is way out in front. It is one species that you are more likely to hear calling during the day. So if you're out walking the dog or anything and you hear this frog calling, or you think you hear this frog calling, do record it on the FrogID app if you can. And here are our records by state. And you can see that New South Wales is really in the lead. We have a strong user base in New South Wales, largely because we are based here in Sydney, and we have a lot of local media interest here. So New South Wales is actually the focus of most of our records, and it's really appropriate record of frogs and helping us understand the impact of frogs after such disastrous events like the fires last summer. So New South Wales data alone is really excellent, and so far it's telling us a lot of different things. So FrogID was the first anecdotal project telling us about the green tree frog decline in Sydney. While most of our records are of common species, particularly when we get communities and government bodies involved, we'd really get more data on the more threatened species. So we're really increasing our records, and this just quadruples when we get community groups involved. This is an example of this. So these are 3 different groups that have FrogID monitoring, regular monitoring events, and have increased the recordings of threatened species in their states. So the Sloan's Champions are in New South Wales, looking at the Sloan's toadlet. The Farms Dam project in WA is looking at how farm dams are restoring frog populations and building their resilience. And then the Frogs Are Calling are a group in Victoria, which is also doing similar things. So now I want to show you what frog records we've been receiving for Wallandilly Shire, but also start with Sydney to compare. So FrogID records in Sydney, we have about 210 FrogID submissions of 3 unique species, and they've been submitted by 78 different FrogID users. But in comparison, when we look at Wallandilly Shire, we've got over 1,000 records of 17 species collected by over 90 users. So really great to see that some of you are already using FrogID and recording a great diverse group of species. One of these is the red-crowned toadlet, Pseudophrene australis, which is a threatened species that's only found in the Sydney Basin. So that's really awesome to see. So what we'd really like in Wallandilly is more frog recordings of all frog species, even the common ones, and even if they're the same frog across at the same pond across subsequent nights, repeat recordings at the same location can really tell us a lot if something changes. And if we think about climate change, we need this long-term data set to be continuing if we're to infer any kind of climate change signatures. So we need recordings of all frogs, but in particular, we are interested in more green tree frogs because of that anecdotal evidence that we've seen of them declining in parts of Sydney. And we're also interested in the Bibrin's toadlet. This is a species we're particularly worried about. It's very rarely recorded. You have 1 recording here in Wallandilly. We think land use change is the issue here, and we'd really love to find out where these species are calling and breeding.
Excuse me, Nadia, are you encouraging people to sort of record them around their house or get out in the bush? Is there any particular preference there about where people should be recording these things?
Yeah, anywhere you hear frogs, really. So whether that's in your backyard, from some of our FrogID users record frogs from their bed at night. But if you're a regular bushwalker and if you hear frogs, we'd love you to record them. Whenever I go out on a bushwalk, if I'm camping overnight, I will tend to go for a quick walk around the creek or the dam to see if any frogs are calling. And all it takes is a minute and I can contribute that information. And of course, safety is important. So only if you can go to these areas and it's safe to and you have access to them. So next just to summarize what FrogID is telling us, we are understanding where our native frog species are found, of course, but also where they're breeding, because only male frogs call, and when they're calling, that means they're breeding. We are also able to identify frog hotspots, and this is really important when we're trying to understand with our limited conservation dollars where we should best protect frogs. We are also understanding the cane toads, so we also get lots of recordings of the cane toad throughout Queensland and Northern Territory and New South Wales, and understanding where they're breeding and where frogs are thriving and where they're not. We're also understanding which species need our help more than others. So which, again, with those limited conservation dollars we have, which species can we prioritize, and also investigate the impact of change thanks to this long-term data set that we're able to develop.
Excuse me, Nadia, are there particular times of year when frogs are breeding, or does it vary from species to species?
Yep, it does vary from species to species, but this time of year, summer, the end of start of November through to summer, is actually the time of year when most of Australia's frogs are calling. And this is why we have one of our biggest events every November is FrogID Week. This is why we've planned that intense capture of data during November every year. But in other parts of Australia, for instance, WA, most of their frogs will be calling in April onwards. So it really depends on the species and region. But again, summer, this time of year, is actually the time when most Australian frogs will be calling. And you can understand their calling period through this FrogID app as well. So we have some, we do get a lot of recordings of common species. So again, your backyard frog is really important for us to understand and record, but we're also getting information about rare and threatened species like the Sloane's froglet in New South Wales. I mentioned that group recording them regularly, and also the Kuranda tree frog that is being monitored by a community group up in North Queensland as well. So frogs call from breeding habitat, and it's important for us to get an idea of what these threatened frogs need. More information about what FrogID tells us. I mentioned the green tree frog. So this is FrogID provided the first data that the iconic Australian green tree frog had almost disappeared from Sydney. It used to be really common across Sydney. And so for decades, there were reports from nature enthusiasts and people working in conservation about the decline, but we didn't have evidence for it. But FrogID is actually showing that yes, species are tragically in decline, unfortunately. So we'd really like to know more about this species if you hear them calling and understand why they're declining. According to our lead scientist, the decline could be attributed to a combination of factors, including predation by dogs and cats and road mortality, and also lack of suitable habitat could be playing a role. But also there's drought having an impact on many of our frog species, which is what we're looking at, as well as fire. We're also understanding invasive species. I mentioned the cane toad, and there is a lot of interest in using the FrogID data to look at machine learning and artificial intelligence to understand where cane toads might be moving to in the invasion front. So that's pretty exciting. Another way of looking at invasive species, even native species can be invasive in some parts of Australia. For example, the eastern dwarf tree frog is actually hitchhiking in pot plants and in cargo, and it's now established and breeding in parts of Victoria. So this can be quite detrimental to native frog populations, as they also can spread disease and also compete with resources there. So we do want to know when these populations have naturalized in other parts of Australia. And so we're monitoring this common, the dwarf tree frog, quite closely for this reason. Other ways that we're filling in knowledge gaps, distributions, breeding seasons, breeding habitats. There's a long list of things we're looking at this very point in time. We're looking at taxonomy, and again, I think this year, we'll keep an eye out for some research that will be coming out because we're continuously looking at new species and new populations. In the future, we will hope to continue our long-term monitoring for threatened species, look at the impacts of climate change and also biosecurity, but also things like looking at platforms to help use the skills and interests of the community to help with our public validation. So getting people who are already well-versed in frog calls to help with that big task of listening to every recording submitted to the FrogID project. We're also looking at making the project more used by Indigenous rangers and people out there that are monitoring landscapes that are very remote, and that would be very valuable to get more FrogID recordings from. So if you're interested, do reach our science page on the FrogID website, which has all of our publications, and most of them also have a scientific blog associated with them, which is also available on the science page. A little bit more about the research papers that we've produced recently. This is related to frog accents. So this was by Savannah Weaver, and it relates to each of Australia's 240 frog species, which again, I've mentioned has a unique call. But within a species, we wanted to know how variable and the renditions of those calls were. So the team investigated just how different individual calls within a species can be by using frog calls submitted to FrogID. And what they discovered was that Australian frogs do have accents, and their accents actually change as we move across the country and even over time. So the team found that most of the variation in a frog call can be captured by analysing the calls of 20 or more individuals distributed across the range of that species and the breeding season. So this is really important because now that we know more about this, our researchers suggest that where possible, the calls of a minimum of 20 individuals, frogs, to analysed for each population or species to be compared quite accurately. Next research, we actually looked at how often frogs call at night, or how likely they are to call at night. And this is the long notion that frogs only call at night, but we actually are refuting this. So using recordings of calling frogs submitted to FrogID, our team took a closer look at just how much of Australia's frogs do restrict their calling at night. And remarkably, they found that 1 in 5 recordings of frogs were actually during the day, and some frog species were recorded more when the sun was out than at night. So these findings have important implications for not only when frog surveys can be carried out, but they pose a whole lot of new questions around why some frogs call during the day. And one of the most important manuscripts by FrogID assessed the immediate response of frogs following the last summer bushfires. So the period immediately after a fire is critical for survival of injured animals and for threatened species. And many conservation biologists were really concerned in the wake of last summer's fires that frogs would just be evaporating. There was no idea how they would survive such intense fires. So our team were really itching to get out there to survey these frogs in these areas, but of course it was too dangerous. There was too much of a risk. And there was also the flooding that came afterwards, and also COVID restrictions really made surveying and getting out there to collect that important data really difficult. So it was a particularly challenging time for our scientists. The fire zone is really too large for scientists to be able to survey frogs in the first few months after fire. But luckily, all was not lost because, thankfully, due to the thousands of people across the fire zone that use FrogID, we received an amazing amount of recordings submitted to FrogID. After the fires, there were about over 600 observations of 45 different frog species. And this is remarkable because the fires were so intense, we thought there'd just no way they could survive. Rare and threatened species were also documented calling post-fire, including the threatened southern barred frog pictured below and the mountain frog. FrogID users also helped us gain over 2,500 observations of 66 different species before the fire. So we really had a good before and after data set, which is continuing to grow. Surprisingly, all the 33 summer breeding frog species, so frogs recorded between December and March since November 2017, they were detected after the fire, which is really, really great. In other words, there were no obviously missing frog species. Every species that was recorded before the fire was detected. And so that gave us a little bit of hope that some frogs have actually survived and even threatened species. But we do need this to keep going. Our team are hoping that the frogs have survived, and we hope that your communities are also continuing to recover after these catastrophic events. But this data for our biodiversity really needs to keep going. We can't get out there to and do this job alone. So we really need more of these FrogID recordings to understand how they're really faring after the fires. Species of high priority that had a large proportion of their range burnt are what we're particularly worried about but new FrogID results are building continuously, and people are working on this information as we speak. So hopefully together, scientists as well as the community can really build our understanding and help conserve our biodiversity. So this is the southern barred frog again, a photo captured in the fire impacted areas of New South Wales by our lead scientist, Dr. Jodie Rowley. And I just wanted to emphasize that recordings of frog calls in both burnt and unburnt areas are really valuable. If you can access a burnt area safely, and safety is the #1 priority, then we'd love you to record frog calls. Next, I'm going to talk about some of the species that we're focusing on. So I think I have another 10 minutes or so. I will try to play the frog calls, but you might not be able to hear them. Again, you can access them on the FrogID app or the FrogID website if you can't hear them. So the first is a southern barred frog, which I've mentioned a couple of times already, Myxophes balbus. It's calling at the moment, and it's really declined a lot in the area. I don't know if you can hear this. It's got a really soft, rapid rattling call, and maybe faintly heard by you right now. It is threatened, and we're really worried it is missing in your area of Wollondilly. It was more common in the north of Sydney, and it is also a species that is of high concern post-fire. Another species is the southern heath frog I've mentioned before, the newly recently discovered science. It will be threatened if there is a lot of concern about this species, as we don't know much about it. And it is really of concern post-fire as well. So if you hear anything that sounds like a creaking, or even if you think it's a cricket, record it anyway, because our experts will let you know if it's what it is. So next we have the giant burrowing frog, which is a really amazing frog found in more inland areas sometimes, and really only comes out after rain. So we really don't know much about this species either, and they're really a high concern post-fire. And I don't know if you can hear its call, but it's really strange, mournful whooping. Sounds more like an owl than a frog. Next is the red-crowned toadlet, which we do have one recording of submitted to FrogID from Wollondilly already. We'd love more recordings. You will often hear this frog under leaf litter at early dusk or dawn, dusk or early evening and at night. And it's got a screeching kind of call, like a squelch. So this is also a frog that you will find on your bushwalks around anywhere around the Sydney region. Next few slides are common frogs that we will find in our backyards or ponds or dams. So more in the urban area is where you'll find most of these species. And we would love to have repeat recordings of these. The striped marsh frog, it sounds like a tennis ball being hit by a racket. It's a short and loud tock, tock, tock. So they breed most parts of the year. And next is the Perrin's tree frog, which is that maniacal cackle sound. It's like a rolling brrr. I can't do frog impersonations very well, but hopefully you can hear it. And it sounds very similar. It looks very similar to other frogs in its distribution. Really distinguished by its call. And lastly, the eastern dwarf tree frog, which is a very tiny frog, only about 3 centimeters big. And it's quite common around our eastern coast and ranges. And its call is like a ratchet, like a rick, pip, 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 rick, pip, pip. So once again, do visit the FrogID website or the app if you weren't able to hear the calls. Here are some tips to FrogID as best as you can. So get as close to the calling frog as you can without disturbing it or its habitat. We don't need photos of frogs at all. We just want the recording. You're welcome to submit photos though alongside recordings, because we like to see what habitat the frogs are found in. For instance, some people find them in the strangest of places. And we also like to see photos for land use change and climate change. So once you get really close to the frog calling, just stop moving for about a minute or so, hold the phone away from you, and wait for the frog to get going and click record. We only need 20 seconds, and it only needs to be calling in part of that. It doesn't need to be calling the entire 20 seconds. Do visit our website. We have some classroom resources there. We've also got the frog profiles. You can also join a local group or create your own FrogID group. What else? We've also got on the website, you can see our top froggers. So some of our top froggers have been submitting thousands of recordings a year. You can also look at the different groups on FrogID and how they rank up together. Also on the FrogID website, you have a little bit more features than the app. So you can look at your captures, which are your recordings. You can see what they were verified as, and you can see the individual comments that our frog call experts have provided against each. We are looking to improve this whole platform once we get some more funding. So if you do have any ideas of how you would like to use FrogID, any features, we welcome them to be emailed to us, as we'd love to make it suitable for our users. I did mention FrogID Week, which happened in November 2020, and this will happen every November, usually the second week, and it occurs across 2 weekends, so 10 days. So do keep an eye out next November, as we will be running another big event, and this is when we try to capture as many calls as possible. Last year was our most successful FrogID Week, maybe thanks to La Nina and all the rain, but many more frogs were calling, and we actually verified over 20,000 frogs in just 10 days. It was really remarkable. And another way, if you're on Instagram, you can also celebrate FrogID by using our Instagram filter. So you can reach this filter on our Instagram account, and just click on it to use it in your living room or your kitchen, or this is of the Cape York graceful tree frog, which was the species that was described by our lead scientists and colleagues in 2016. It's also the species of frog that's on our FrogID logo. So he is quite a special frog to us, Litoria bella. But the main thing I want to get across today is that every call counts, whether that is from your backyard or a bushfire impacted area. Every call is really valuable to us, so we really appreciate it. Continued use of the FrogID app, even if it's the same the same frog at the same pond over time, can really tell us a lot about how frogs are going and what we need to do to protect them. So thank you so much for listening. I do welcome any more questions you have, and if you do use the FrogID app and come across any tech issues, do feel free to email us. Our email is on the FrogID website, or you can send us a message on Facebook, and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. We love hearing from our users, so do feel free to reach out. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for your time, Nadia. That's been really interesting, and it's amazing to see what you can do with that little app from your smartphone. It's quite incredible.
Yeah, thanks. And sorry about the sound. I'll have to look into that.
That's okay. But as you said, all those sounds are available in the app. And yeah, I guess also we're hoping our residents look at ways that they can sort of improve frog habitat around their houses and in their backyards. Have you got any sort of quick tips around that?
Yeah, so we get this question a lot. So we have some resources on the FrogID website about frog ponds, because we do have a partnership with Bunnings, and we were delivering these with schools, but they do apply for any backyard really. So creating frog hotels for tree frogs in particular, they like to find hiding holes like your litter boxes and your watering cans and pot plants. But you can also use PVC pipes to create frog habitat. And also if you create a frog pond, just ensuring that you can grow the grass a bit around the frog pond, making sure that there are exit ramps for the frog, because not all frogs are really good swimmers. Tree frogs do climb and things, but some frogs can't stand in the water for very long and can drown. So we need lots of rocks and logs and things to make sure they can enter and exit the water safely. And also the tadpoles and frogs can have hiding spots, as many hiding spots as possible to protect them from the heat and things like that, and also predators. Other things to be thinking about is, I guess, pollution. So you don't want to put in some, chemicals on your lawn and then have it rain that same day and for it to run off into the pond, because frogs are very sensitive to change and they breathe through their skin. So thinking about chemicals and also little microhabitats for frogs are the main thing I would say.
That's great. Now you've posted out some resources for us, which we're going to have up at our community nursery. So thank you very much for that as well. And I guess, we've been trying to grow more plants that are frog friendly up at our nursery as well. So certainly anyone who's interested in trying to create a nice frog habitat at home, come up and see us at the nursery. Like I said, Nadia has posted a whole bunch of handouts and resources for us, which is great. Thank you. And yes, we're trying to diversify the types of plants. Now, Nadia, what type of plants do frogs generally sort of like to hang out in?
Yeah, I'm not sure of the particular plants. There are some certain aquatic plants, but their name evades me. Some of just the native aquatic plants that you would have around your ponds and your local Bunnings or aquarist can help with that. But I think the main thing to be that would harm frogs are actually fish. So if you have goldfish or fish that would eat tadpoles, that would be harmful. They eat frog eggs and tadpoles and small frogs. So Pacific blue eye fish are frog friendly, and most of the native fish are frog friendly, but that might need a bit of a help from the aquarium person or Bunnings.
Great. Well, thanks again very much, Nadia. Hopefully our residents get going on that frog app, and we try and boost up the number of records we have for the Wollondilly here, and who knows, we may even find some rare frogs out and about. Yeah,
we'd love to. We're going to keep an eye out and let you know if we do see anything, but yeah, hopefully. Fingers crossed. Thanks for the opportunity again, and do take care, and hopefully the frogs are calling around you all soon.
Great. Well, thanks again for your time, Nadia. Much appreciated. It's been very informative. Thank you very much.
No problem. Thanks.
Cheers. Bye.
Bye.